The agreement between Russia and Ukraine to allow the shipping of food grain and fertilizers has ended. What does this mean for peace and for global food security? Tunisia and the European Union claim to have come to a new understanding on steps to be taken to tackle immigration via what Europe calls illegal routes. While this is being billed as a step to hurt human trafficking or human traffickers, we ask how it will affect the thousands who are forced to leave home in the hope of staying alive. And at Wimbledon, we have new champions, which is always, of course, a good sign as far as the health of the sport is concerned. But is this the much awaited generational change of guard? Sharda Ugra, the world famous sports writer, will tell us what she thinks. You're watching the Daily Debrief, coming to you as always from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani, and on the show today, first up, in another blow to the prospect of peace in Eastern Europe as well as to global food security, the agreement between Russia and Ukraine to allow shipments of food grain as well as fertilizers to be shipped through, of course, Turkish as well as Russian-controlled waters stands terminated. The last ship left Ukraine on Sunday, bringing the total up to 32 million tons of material that Russia has allowed to be shipped out since the deal came into force in July last year. Abdul is with us in the studio and covers some of these subjects for People's Dispatch. Abdul, explain to us why the deal fell apart. It took so long to broker. The UN as well as Turkey had to come together to bring the two parties to the table. Russia, of course, the Kremlin claiming that its side of the bargain has not been maintained.
And that is the primary reason. If you see, Russia has been pushing for, there are many, earlier the details were not there, but now the details are out. And one specific demand which Russians had put when the deal was finalized last year in July was the basically revocation of Russian agricultural banks delinking from the SWIFT payment system. Once the payment system, it was delinked because of the sanctions imposed on Russia by European Union and US since the war in Ukraine started. Of course, that Russians' export of its own agricultural products became much more difficult because the payment of most of the countries come through the SWIFT system.
Right.
So they had demanded that they will allow the grain export from Ukraine through the Black Sea in return that the Russian Agricultural Bank is linked again to the SWIFT
given
system.
The ability to basically transact.
So that was one of the main reasons cited by the Russians for, in fact, Putin, when he spoke on Thursday, he basically specified these a part of Russian concern. The other important element, of course, was Russia's concern that the deal was signed primarily to ease the food prices, global food prices, to help the poorer countries in Africa in particular, which were suffering, which are still suffering from the high food grain prices because they are predominantly dependent on grains from Ukraine and Russia. Instead of exporting the grains to the poorer countries, 40% of all the grain went to Western Europe, the richest countries on the globe. And that basically Russia has been raising this issue. Each time when there was an extension coming, Russia reiterated these demands. Apparently, none of these demands were addressed. And that is the reason, basically, after giving an ultimatum on Thursday and seeing that nothing is coming, nothing concrete is coming, as per the reports, UN General Secretary had offered that instead of Russian Agricultural Bank, one of the subsidiaries will be linked to the SWIFT. It seems Russians were not happy with that, and then that became the reasons for their termination from their part.
So in the context of who entered into this agreement in the first place and who is imposing the sanctions, there's a gap. Clearly, right? So while the UN may be justifiably concerned about global food prices and global food security, and we talked about the FAO's most recent report on the show earlier, indicating how much of an impact actually this war has had on that specific subject. The EU and its allies have a seemingly different perspective on things.
Of course, it seems that they are not even ready to understand this particular, it seems Russia had the only responsibility to understand the food crisis or the food insecurity in the world, and rich European countries do not have any responsibility. They will not lift the sanctions, they will not relink Russian Agriculture Bank to the SWIFT, but and also they will take a larger chunk of the grain exported from Ukraine after the agreement. They will get the benefits of it, and yet they will have their policies intact vis-a-vis Russia. So their part of the bargain is not there. So that seems to be quite hypocritical from a Russian point of view, or a point of view which is not part of this
neutral perspective.
Neutral perspective, of course. And that basically becomes the issue. It is, nobody can deny the Europeans also, when they talk about rising in food insecurity, of course they are also now increasingly being affected because of the idea of the cost of living crisis emerging, their working class demonstrating on the ground. Of course, for the first time, even the Western Europe and in Northern Africa, the food insecurity is rising, as we discussed about when we talked about the FAO report. So yes, they are also affected, but the effect on the larger global south in particular, and African countries, which are predominantly, as we said before, are relying on the grain exports from Ukraine and Russia. European needs to understand that the sanctioning Russia is not hurting Russia as much as it is hurting the poorer countries in Africa. And that realization, apparently, it seems that the UN General Secretary, who talks about food insecurity on every occasion possible, was failed to convey it to the European Union members and convince them to take this step to address the Russian concerns. And that failure, of course, is a failure of the global diplomacy. It is not a failure of an individual, of course.
All right. Thank you, Abdul. I think we'll leave it there on this for now, except unless maybe you can also broadly just point out to us in case it's not clear. But again, from a neutral perspective, does it seem like a further step in a continual process of escalation?
See, in last few at least weeks, if you see, there is escalation from both, primarily from the NATO side. There Ukrainian talk about Ukrainian becoming a member. Of course, they were not invited fully, but that is there. That has been raised despite the objections, and that being one of the root causes for the war.
Conflict,
Then supply of what do you call it, cluster bombs, despite Russian objections, despite the objections raised by majority of the global countries and human rights organizations. And if you see, today there was an attack on the bridge which links with Crimea and Russia, mainland Russia. So there is counteroffensive going on. There is no initiative for dialogue, and all the initiatives made by countries in Africa or countries like China and other global members of the global community have been shot down by the US and the NATO members. So there is a complete lack of any initiative to find a solution to the conflict, and over and above that, there are provocative steps taken one after the other. So Russians, of course, if you see it from outside, Russians seems to have no other option but to kind of retaliate in whatever way they can.
In the same kind of vein also. Abdul, we are also speaking about an issue which is in some ways connected and also pertains to the European Union. So we'll ask you to stick around for 30 seconds. The hawkish head of the EU, of course, Ursula von der Leyen, along with Italy's right-wing leader, Giorgia Meloni, and Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, held talks with Tunisian President Kais Saied in response to the growing number of refugees and asylum seekers looking to get across the sea and find a better sort of life and liberty in Europe. Of course, that is the promise, that is the dream. Abdul, given the sort of vibe that you might have felt if you were in the room with these leaders of today, what are what are the terms of this new memorandum of understanding between Tunisia and the EU, and then we can maybe talk about the whole approach towards this process of migration.
Well, the details are not yet out. We don't know the nitty-gritties of it, but given the experience we have, where EU's deals with Libya and its earlier deal with older deal with Turkey. Of course, Turkey's deal is different in nature, but that the basic issue remains the same.
Yeah.
The Europeans want to discourage or prevent people coming to its shores seeking asylum. And for that, they are ready to fund whichever country, in whatever way possible, is willing to do their job of patrolling their borders. And that means taking whatever measures possible in violation of whatever human rights we talk about. So exactly that is what has happened. If you read the announcement made by Vendor, Leyen and the Prime Minister of the Dutch Prime Minister or the Italian Prime Minister, all of them have reiterated that part of the 900 plus million euros will go to building a kind of border security arrangement mechanism inside Tunisia. That was the primary announcement. Of course, they've also sugar-coated this particular aspect of the deal with other, for example, Tunisia is suffering from economic crisis. So they are basically saying that a part of this 900 plus billion euros will go to kind of addressing some of the economic concerns in Tunisia. It will also provide that part of the money will go for the you can say branding or reviving the Tunisian education system, primarily the school building, and some scholarship for Tunisian students to go to Europe and exchange. That is, these are the things which have been identified, announced. But the primary objective remains how to control the flow of migrants from Tunisia across the Mediterranean to Italy in particular. Italy, for example, yesterday or few days back, issued a statement according to which the number of immigrants to Italy has increased to 75,000 since the beginning of the year, in comparison to 31,000 last year, the whole year. So according to them, this is a big flood of migrants coming in Europe, and they want to prevent it as much as possible.
Right, because $900 billion might not be able to help to solve the problem at their end, of course.
That's their thinking, yeah.
So which brings us to the conditions, perhaps, Abdul, and maybe that's most pertinent to talk about, under which this sort of wave of migration is happening, and what you were referring to, the kind of support that these governments, the European Union extends to governments that make it more difficult for people to stay, to live, to earn a livelihood, as well as to express whatever it is that they need to in their own countries. That is why primarily they are leaving. So what is the situation in Tunisia? We haven't touched on it for a while. I think.
That is very important. If you see, ever since Kais Saied came to power, there has been an attempt to, and of course, this is a diversionary tactics used by most of the rulers across the world to kind of whip up anti-immigrant sentiment in Tunisia, and particularly against the immigrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa. There have been reported cases of rise in racial hatred and violence in Tunisia since Kais Saied gave a statement claiming that the migrants from sub-Saharan Africa coming to Tunisia to change the overall character of Tunisia, to make it more of an African country than an Arab country. The irony is Tunisia is an African country, no matter what Kais Saied thinks. Anyway, so that became, despite the fact that this has been opposed by the human rights groups and the left parties inside Tunisia. A larger group, there has been an increase of violence against immigrants. And recently, on July first week of July, hundreds of migrants were pushed out of Tunisia's second largest city and pushed out of, in fact, Tunisia to the borders of Libya or Algeria. And according to the Red Cross there, around 600 people have been sheltered by it. So you can understand the extent of it. That basically the rise of hatred, and of course the larger continent's economic condition, result of longer periods of colonial and imperial practices inside the continent, has created a situation where the hundreds of people come to Tunisia and Libya in particular to migrate to Europe. And this hatred, rising hatred, also creates an additional pressure on the people who are not ready to, earlier they were not ready to move out of Tunisia, they were not willing to go anywhere else, at least for now. They are forced to kind of take the desperate measure and move out of Tunisia and go to Europe. So this push and pull, whatever you call it, basically creates a situation where hundreds of people die every year by drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, sometimes starving because their boat is stranded in the sea without any food and any water. So the human tragedy is big, but Europeans only think about their own immediate concerns, which is basically coming of the migrants will mean the quote-unquote economic issues according to their own calculations. As you rightly pointed out, $900 million could have been used to build infrastructure or build opportunities for these asylum seekers in their own countries. But instead of doing that, that is more of a cultural
or strengthen
reaction.
other aspects of their own economy to give who they consider their own people jobs and other opportunities.
So it's more of a reactionary xenophobic reaction than economic concerns.
Soundly.
So that is quite obvious. And this deal again proves it.
All right. Thanks very much, Abdul. We'll leave it there for today. Thanks for setting up our Monday episode of Daily Debrief. And finally, though, not all doom and gloom. We also like to throw in a bit of distraction where we can. And what better than Wimbledon, I guess, on this occasion. The men's final happened on Sunday and the women's final the day before that on Saturday, along with, of course, doubles and mixed doubles and all the rest of it. On the men's side, on both sides, of course, there are new champions. But on the men's side, for the first time in over 10 years, Novak Djokovic lost a game at centre court, and 20-year-old Carlos Alcaraz from Spain, the reigning world number 1, is the new Wimbledon champion. Sharda Ogra joins us via video conference to talk about both the men and women's tournaments and whether finally we might see the change of guard that we've been waiting for in the sport of tennis for quite a while. Sharda, back-to-back episodes of the show that we've had you on. I think this is the best we've done in a long time. First up, the women's side of, and we look at only singles because, of course, we have just a short amount of time on the show. Marketa Vondrousova of the Czech Republic becoming the first unseeded player, of course, in the professional era to win Wimbledon. Is it, like, we've been looking at women's tennis as being the more open and competitive of the two draws, at least as far as singles is concerned. Is this something that has been sort of reiterated? And also, if you can add a little bit on Ons Jabeur losing again in the final at the last step, what that might be like.
Hi, Siddhant. Yeah, everyone seemed to be waiting for Ons Jabeur to win for so many reasons, other than the fact that she's an incredibly creative and incredibly watchable player. But Marketa Vondrousova's story in itself, the fact that a year ago she was injured, she was walking around with a cast, she had wrist surgery, it is reflective of the women's game, that it's actually far more even spread out, the talent. And you can see that this is not a top 10 player. This is someone from outside the the elite ranks of the game. but was able to play with such great calmness and confidence and athleticism. I think what we're always reminded about the women's game when you watch the final is the elevation of athleticism to where it is today. Ons Jabbar, I think, is a very, very popular player. She's a favorite for everyone. And like she keeps saying, her time will come. But in the sense, the pressure on her was perhaps what made Vondrousova play just the most beautiful, flowing kind of a game, and we were able to see her skills and her athleticism and her utter calmness through everything, except the last when she was serving for the final. But before that, she was just completely in control.
There's bound to be a bit of, I suppose, butterflies, jitters, whatever you want to call it, when you're just almost there. But moving ahead to the men's side of things, Carlos Alcaraz also you thought might have the same, but in that sense, he did the opposite right at the end. Firstly, taking a set off Novak Djokovic in a tiebreak, right, which hasn't happened much this year, at least, not in the bigs. And then sort of in the final set, holding his own, showing the kind of composure that you're talking about, the calmness, and of course playing an incredibly athletic and, I mean, at some points, like absolutely ridiculous tennis as well.
Yeah, ridiculous tennis was the thing. I think he's learned from what happened in his last sort of encounter with Novak Djokovic. And a lot of us were discussing about the pressure of playing Djokovic itself. You see that going by what Yannick Sinner said, they're so respectful of the competitor that they're going to face, as was Carlos Alcaraz before the final. But he held his nerve and he was able to raise the standard of his game to match that of Djokovic's. Djokovic made one ginormous error at the start of the unforced error at the start of the set. He could have gone up 2-love, and then you never know how he goes there. But Alcaraz was able to pull everything back and then produce those incredible returns and incredible passing shots. And you're thinking that it was like he was ready for the day. He was ready. He has a Grand Slam title with him, but all the boxes that had to be, that you thought that couldn't be ticked of Novak Djokovic playing against him, he did all of that, and in fine style. And I think other than and just competed, both of them, for a change, not for a change, sort of competed with a great deal of respect for each other as well. With age and all the rest of it that went. It was a lovely final to watch.
So, it was indeed a great final to watch, and which, it's something that, again, we said we would touch on, so we will. Does it now indicate that this generation, there's so many young players in the mix, whether it's Holger Rune, of course, Alcaraz himself, so many other young guys, 20, 21, 22, 23. Is there now a chance of looking at more of them maturing and actually it being that generational shift that we talked about so often?
I know the generation shift we've been waiting for almost one or two generations, literally. Okay, now somebody. But I think Alcaraz has literally broken away from this pack, and now everyone has to catch him. Even though sort of the old guys will be around, that is Djokovic. I think Alcaraz, he's won 2 Grand Slams, and the one that he won against Djokovic, I think this time, is a big breakthrough. You've seen people put in really good performances in, say, an earlier round victory or in another tournament, in an ATP event. But for Alcaraz to pull this off at a slam, he said, never mind the new generation. Now beat me. I'm the person to be beaten. And he's just 20 years old. It'll be a huge, everyone, all the superstars, all the Gen Next guys have to now catch up with him and play the kind of game that's there. Because he set the standard, say, for the next, I don't know how many years now. We kept thinking it was 10, but the big three have made it last almost 15, so there's no saying.
Right. Thanks very much. Alcaraz, of course, at just a little over 20, becoming the 3rd youngest to win the men's single title at Wimbledon after, of course, 17-year-old Boris Becker and the legendary Bjorn Borg. Thank you, Sharda. Always a pleasure talking to you. And also, with that, we'll bring to a close this episode of the show. Thank you for watching today's show, as always. We also invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for details on these stories and all of the other work we do. And also follow us on social media for regular updates. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.